Welcome to the third of our Jesus Talks as we continue to think about the historical accounts of Jesus. Well, as we read through the eyewitness accounts, the biographies of Jesus, it's clear that although there are marked differences in style, there is also a clear overlap or even dependence on each other as we think about those four Gospels. Well, Matthew, Mark and Luke are referred to as synoptic, meaning having the same view, because they not only record the same incidents, but even the very words used to describe them have a lot of overlap. So, are they copying from each other? Or was there, as Luke suggests, earlier accounts that were all used by these biographers? It's hard to describe the frenzy and diversity that has surrounded this simple question, particularly over the past 150 years. Maybe a bit less now. Whole careers and schools of thought have risen and fallen around arguments about whether Matthew copied Mark or Luke copied both Matthew and Mark, or whether they were all copying a hypothetical earlier document that's been labelled Q. Needless to say, there's no possible way that we can get definitive answers to these questions, and it's not at all clear what difference it would make anyway. It seems most hazardous and quite unnecessary to pin all our thinking and research on any one of these speculative theories and allow that to shape or control what we read in these four sort of official biographies of Jesus. Perhaps they all had copies of the same earlier popular witnesses, or perhaps they had access to each other. Perhaps one of them wrote their biography before the others and it became a valuable source for the others. Perhaps they shared notes. Perhaps the oral tradition stuck to verbal formulas. John and Matthew at face value were eyewitnesses of the events they wrote about, and tradition says that Mark was writing up the memoirs of Peter. Whereas there is plenty of material for endless research and speculation. None of it seems to make any difference to the biographies of Jesus. We will simply try to take these biographies at face value, looking into the events they describe, following up any quotations that they make, and try to get a sense of who this Jesus of Nazareth was and why he made such a decisive impact on the ancient world. We'll also try to respect the individual style and viewpoint of each biographer. Matthew tends to be very aware of the Old Testament background, whereas Luke tends to notice how these events relate to the wider world. Mark is perhaps trying to give the outsider a way into all that's happened, whereas John brings out the deeper cosmic significance of all that was said and done. Various people down the ages have tried to iron out all the differences between the four Gospels and produce a single harmonized account. A man called Tatian was one of the first to do this. He was born in Syria in around 120 AD. He lived to around 185 AD. He produced a variety of books about Jesus of Nazareth, but perhaps his most famous was a work called the Diatessaron, meaning from the four. Tatian attempted to combine the four official biographies into one single biography, and this was a very popular book for hundreds of years, particularly in Syria. Notice that the book was called From the Four, and that's important evidence of the fact that the four official biographies were recognized and accepted from these very early generations of the Jesus movement. He didn't have to say what the four were. Everybody knew the title, Diatessaron, from the four Gospels. We mention this simply because occasionally a myth goes around that the biographies of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John were only selected by Constantine in the 4th century, or that there were dozens of biographies of Jesus used by the early Christians around the world. Anyway, Tatian's work was certainly popular and was almost used instead of the 4 biographies in the Syriac churches until the 5th century. However, we will not follow Tatian's example here. There are important clues in the differences between the biographers of Jesus. If we pretend that these differences are not there, or we smooth them over too easily, we're not doing justice to the original material that's available to us. We must let each of these early writers tell the story of Jesus just as they want to. If that makes life a little more difficult for the modern historian or scholar, well, that's simply something we must live with and maybe even learn to appreciate. One final note of introduction. We don't have the original documents that these biographers wrote, the actual paper and pens and ink. The British Library has an absolutely amazing section of its online profile where you can see the original manuscripts of many important literary works. For example, it's possible to see Jane Austen's History of England written in her own handwriting, in her own notebook. It's amazing to see the very paper and ink that these books were written on, from which all copies and published editions are taken. Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, that can be inspected with William Blake's notebooks of sketches and poems. It's well worth an afternoon of pleasure if you enjoy that sort of thing, just to see what's available. Now, we don't have anything like that when we're considering the original manuscripts of these biographies of Jesus. The actual scrolls or sheets of papyrus that they were written on by these historians or their secretaries, well, they're long gone from human history. Yet, again, as we study the actual teaching and practice of Jesus of Nazareth, we will see that he thought about the preservation of his teachings after he would have ascended to the highest heaven and made provision for that. It's no accident that he appointed key leaders to be authorized eyewitnesses of all that he did and said. There is a Greek word that Jesus uses at a key time when he's preparing for the future of his community, and that word is parakletos. This was a word used for a legal expert who would be the counsel for the defense, or the one who would advocate the defendant's cause in the legal trial. It could also be used of an orator who presented an argument in a powerful and convincing way. As we go on, we'll see that Jesus actually ensured that he would have a parakletos, one who would stay around to make sure his life and work and teaching would be presented in a powerful and convincing way. An authorized representative who would be behind all that the eyewitnesses said. Someone who would ensure that his teaching and the record of what he'd done would be preserved for future generations. Now, as incredible as this sounds, the very fact that we are able to study these 4 biographies today is testimony to the skill and power of that paraclete appointed by Jesus of Nazareth. Well, we'll come back to that issue of the paraclete later, but what do we have in terms of physical bits of papyrus or actual books? Well, first, remember that we don't have very many books and manuscripts of any kind from the ancient world. These documents don't survive for very long, especially if they're being regularly used by the communities that copied them so carefully. Second, we do have a few fragments from the 1st and 2nd century with bits of these biographies on them. It's hard to date these pieces, and we have to rely on handwriting experts who try to place them in a sequence of handwriting styles, and sometimes we can examine the chemical composition of the paper and so on. Nevertheless, by the time we get into the 3rd and 4th centuries, we have complete copies of the entire New Testament. For example, there's a papyrus referred to as P45 containing these 4 biographies of Jesus and the book of Acts, Paul's letters, John's Revelation. And P45 is believed to come from between 200 AD and 250 AD. Third, there are many variations between all the different copies of the biographies. As the books were copied and recopied, so words might be missed out or misspelt, lines might be skipped, and sometimes the copyist might attempt to modify something that he was unsure about. And remember that if one copy has a change in the text, then all the subsequent generations who copy from that copy will have that same change in them. And because of this, it's possible to work out sort of sophisticated genealogies for different families of copies, tracing where they came from and which copies they were copied from. There is much more that we could say about this, and if you want to find out more, there's a website called biblefacts.org, and that's got plenty of information with photos of these early fragments, scrolls and books. The variations in the texts number thousands, tens of thousands of variations in all these different scraps and manuscripts, and anyone can buy a critical edition of the current state of the Greek text of the New Testament that displays in lengthy footnotes all the different variations and which manuscripts have which variants. Nevertheless, this is much less exciting than the sensational bestseller writers portray it. Because at first it might sound like there's an enormous variety of different accounts of Jesus and saying quite different things and all sorts of quite different beliefs indicated. But far from presenting many different views of Jesus, the variations have very little impact on the finished product. It's to do with letters missing or slightly different spellings or very small variations. And perhaps 2% of the text of the biographies is in any doubt about what was originally written, and none of that 2% has any impact on the facts about Jesus that are so well established in the teaching of his followers. There are a couple of quite fun highlights, like there's the possibility that Mark's biography had some sentences appended at the end at some time that may not have been originally written by Mark. So if you look at the end of Mark's Gospel, there's some verses right at the end, and there's quite a bit of variation on that, and some people say they weren't written by Mark at all but were added by somebody later. And then another quite fun one is at the beginning of John 8, a story of a woman taken in adultery that's similar, that sometimes that's placed at the end of the Gospel. And then there's a curious sentence about the Trinity, which may have been inserted into some copies of John's first letter, 1 John 5 verse 7, at a later date. But what we just thought of, those are the really big things where you've got like a sequence of verses where there's variation on. But and even those, the doctrine of the Trinity doesn't rely on 1 John 5:7 at all. In fact, It's hardly ever referenced when people are teaching about the Trinity. So again, the ideas contained in these variations are either clearly taught elsewhere or else are of no substantive value to our understanding of Jesus of Nazareth. But they are interesting, and I like to look at all those variations just for sometimes slightly different emphases, perhaps. Well, here's our conclusions. When we hear wild claims made not only by fiction writers but also by proponents of religious systems that the biographies of Jesus were either invented hundreds of years after the events, or that they were seriously modified under political or religious pressure or controversy, it's probably not wise to get drawn into those kinds of paranoid conspiracy theories. They sell books, but they're very insubstantial. The documents are in libraries and museums around the world, catalogued and photographed for anyone to see. Handbooks of textual criticism are easily available for those who want to go further with this. But we, in our studies of Jesus talks, we don't want to spend any more time with this now. And if we want to find out about Jesus of Nazareth, we have these 4 biographies containing eyewitness accounts, ordered and arranged to enable us to understand why the whole world changed around a man with no armies, no money, no formal education, no political power, and no body of books to his name. Maybe he didn't write anything. So let's begin with the birth and childhood of Jesus of Nazareth, and that's what we'll do in our next study.